Please welcome Rodney Alcala.
I'll take one.
Answer number one.
It was one of the most famous dating shows ever.
Looking back, it is chilling to realize that this iconic show would unknowingly feature a remorseless killer.
The horror story begins. I remember wanting to jump out of the car.
The so-called dating game killer is one of the country's most notorious criminals, but one most people have never heard of.
He had sociopathic personality traits. He had no shame. He walks up and down the streets and asks people if he can take their picture.
What better place to be a sexual predator than to go to a feeding frenzy like New York?
She's been strangled with nylon stockings.
It's the talk of the town.
Rodney Alcala has murdered at least 5 women. The FBI put Rodney Alcala on the 10 most wanted list.
Oh my God, will Alcala get away with it?
The body count is piling up. He goes on the hunt for more victims, and there's absolutely nothing to stop him.
And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Sometimes I think Chris was probably hitchhiking, probably looking to get away somewhere, and he just probably stopped for her.
She's by herself. She could have met him at a gas station when he's filling up. Can you give me a lift? But somewhere along the lines, I think he was giving her a ride someplace. I don't think she had any indication what was about to happen to her.
Chris was very trusting, so that was her downfall. My sister Christine was born Christine Ruth Thornton, but we always called her Chris. She was 11 years older than me. Chris was tall. She was 5'10", dark hair, dark eyes, just, a beautiful person inside and out. In the summer of '77, Chris was just 27 years old. Chris was in San Antonio. She was pregnant at the time.
Christine was a free spirit. She kind of went where the wind blew her.
She met up with her boyfriend and, had this crazy idea of going to Montana to pan for gold.
And my understanding is that they were in southwest Wyoming and had an argument ensued between the two of them, and he left her pregnant and alone, and I believe that's the last time anybody had ever seen her.
In the summer of '78, I decided to go down to San Antonio and do some investigating of my own. I actually tried to find her boyfriend, but did not have a good address for him. The San Antonio police refused to take a missing persons report on Chris because she was an adult.
I believe throughout all the years that Christine was missing, I think Kathy was always looking for a way to open up that door of where she is. In '82, this herder out in the middle of nowhere comes across a pile of bones, obviously human remains.
What they found was it was a body of a 25 to 35-year-old female. Along with her bones were also bones of an infant.
There wasn't any identification, and so it remained cold for many years.
And investigators never imagined that those bones would lead them to a notorious serial killer, a man I would later be called upon to prosecute. And this photograph, discovered by police, would lead a heartbroken family to their loved one missing for almost 40 years. Her smile shared by a tragic list of young women and girls who trusted a charming stranger, only to discover a dark secret that began back in the fall of 1968.
So '68 was tumultuous. It was sort of flower power, free living. It was quite an era and quite a year.
Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, assassinated. Andy Warhol was shot that year. And there have been urban uprisings throughout the 60s.
Being a police officer in Los Angeles or anywhere in the country for that matter at that time, everything was anti-war, anti-establishment.
And it's commented on by some of the leading vocalists of the day. You had Barry McGuire in 1965 doing "Youth of Destruction."
Eastern world, it is exploding.
You had Bob Dylan, of course, doing "A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." So what we're seeing is the influence of the new freedoms represented by the counterculture be appropriated by mainstream culture. And that includes daytime television. That even includes game shows like The Dating Game.
The Dating Game began with Chuck Barris back in, I believe it was 1965. He had dealings with ABC, and he just came up with the idea, and he pitched it to a couple of people. It caught on right away.
The premise was a female asking questions of three bachelors who sat on the other side of a partition. She wasn't able to see them, of course, and she picked one for a date, and then she met the guy that she had picked, and they were awarded a date.
Looking back, it is chilling to realize that this iconic show, celebrating love and romance, would unwittingly feature a remorseless killer.
Welcome once again to The Dating Game.
And from the mid-60s onward, Southern California is a mecca for anyone looking to reinvent him or herself and have a fantastic time. They're all partying at some of the hotels on the Strip, like the Chateau Marmont.
Tali Shapiro was an 8-year-old little girl who lived at Chateau Marmont, which is a famous hotel in California.
Her father was a music industry executive. She had a mother and a sister and a brother, and they were living there because their house had gone on fire, and they were staying there temporarily. And a car pulls up alongside of her.
And it's this man who says, "Oh, it's okay, I'm not a stranger. I know your parents. I'm friends with your parents."
And she thought, well, maybe I'll get in the car.
Well, fortunately, a good citizen looks at this and says, "I don't like the looks of this."
Tali Shapiro was 8 years old, and it was a beautiful sunny day in September.
And this adorable little girl would skip to school each morning, carefree, loving, wearing her little white Mary Janes. And then the horror story of Tali begins.
I remember the morning was nice and warm because I wore the dress that my nanny had crocheted for me.
And a car pulls up alongside of her, and the man leans out and says, I have a beautiful picture I'd like to show you.
And I guess asked if I needed a ride to school. And I told him I didn't talk to strangers.
And he pulled up alongside of her a little further, kept trolling her.
And that's when he told me he knew my parents. And I really didn't want to get in the car, but I was raised to respect my elders. I got in the car, that's when he asked what time my school started. And then that's when he realized we had plenty of time and he was going to swing by and show me a poster. You know, I didn't know to fear people.
Well, fortunately, a good citizen looks at this and says, "I don't like the looks of this." And he actually follows him to his apartment.
The moment I felt danger was when he wanted to go by his place. And I remember wanting to get out of the car.
So the Good Samaritan, he actually followed the car to a residence where the man took the little girl out of the car and walked her inside. And that didn't look right.
And he calls the police. He says, "This is real hinky looking. I don't like it. There's this little girl. I think you ought to check it out."
I don't remember going up to the apartment, and I don't remember anything after that.
I was driving down Sunset heading toward West Hollywood when I received a call to go see a man about a possible kidnapping. I followed him over to the location. At that time I thought, okay, I better call in for a backup. So I went and called in and requested a backup unit. I went to the front door and started knocking. I could hear someone running around.
So the man came and he opened up the curtains a little bit and peered out and said, "Oh, sorry, I was in the shower. I'll be right there.
I see this male person on the other side, no clothes, not dripping with water, no towel. And I said, oh, okay, you need to open the door right now. I need to come in. And he said, wait, let me put my pants on. And I said, okay, you got 3 seconds. I probably waited 5 seconds, and I kicked the door in. To the right was a dining room, to the left was a living room, and straight ahead was a kitchen. And here was this little girl, blood all over the place, clothes, shoes, and a dress thrown to one side. There was coins on the floor, and she had this steel bar across her neck, which probably weighed 2 pounds.
And there's an image that I will never forget. It's an image of this pipe used to strangle her with, essentially. Press it against her throat. And more blood than should ever be able to come out of a little 8-year-old girl next to these Mary Jane shoes on the floor of this kitchen.
I looked at her. I thought she was dead. She wasn't breathing. The other officers came around. We were looking for the suspect. I went back to check on Telly, and I just couldn't leave her there like that.
The officer had a sort of a life or death decision to make. Chase this man out the back and catch him, or render life-saving aid to the little girl and save her life. And he chose the little girl.
And as I went back in the kitchen, she started gagging, Telly. So then that put everything into high gear. But when I was yelling, the officer that was covering the back door thought I was asking for help. So he ran to the front to help me. We later found out the suspect escaped through the back door.
Telly was bleeding out, literally clinging to life. Fortunately, there was already an ambulance racing to the scene.
Tally arrived in the emergency room, and the doctor said there was no chance of saving her. And after she had been taken by the ambulance, they started looking around the apartment to see if there were any clues as to who the person was.
I found his ID. We determined he was a student at UCLA in the photography department.
And the name of the man who attended UCLA was Rodney Alcala.
They searched that house, and there are references in reports of hundreds and hundreds of photographs of young women and boys in various stages of dress, in various stages of vulnerability that were in Rodney Alcala's possession.
We had to find this Rodney Alcala. We had to get him off the street. Because if he would do that to a little 8-year-old girl, there's no telling what he would do.
It was just by, sheer luck that Tally didn't die. She should have died, but she didn't.
She was in a coma for 32 days. Nobody thought that she would survive, and miraculously, she pulled through.
She was able to get back on her feet after several months in the hospital.
My parents mentioned nothing. It was never brought up. It was never spoken about. I remember walking into my classroom, and everyone looked at me like I was supposed to be dead.
And her parents had just had enough. They could not stay in California another minute.
They moved out of the country shortly after that. They moved to Mexico. The father wanted to give her a better, safer environment to live in.
And that's where they stayed for the next many years.
Rodney Alcala has gotten away, and now he's fled, and nobody knows where he's gone.
I was a police officer with LAPD. This was one of my very first cases, actually, and it was 4 or 5 months old at that time, and he was in the wind. I went out and interviewed a number of his professors at UCLA. One of the things they told me is, you got the wrong guy. Rod Alcala is a super guy. He wouldn't hurt a flea. Really nice guy.
Police wanted to know who is Rodney Alcala, and why would this well-liked 25-year-old college student so viciously attack an 8-year-old little girl?
This is San Antonio, Texas, home of the Alamo.
Rodney Alcala was born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucor on August 23, 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. He had an older brother, Raul. He had an older sister, and then he had a younger sister.
His family lived in Mexico for a while.
The grandma passed away, and the father left the family.
They ended up
moving to Los Angeles area to Monterey Park. He had everything he wanted, Ocala. He went to Catholic schools, he went to, private schools.
Everyone who knew him said he was a kind boy, a respectful boy, and highly intelligent.
Rodney Ocala had every advantage that somebody could have in life. He had a mother who loved him, which is a big deal psychologically. He had friends. He had brothers and sisters who all turned out to be very successful.
His older brother was already at West Point, so this is a pretty, patriotic family.
And then he joined the Army in the early 60s, and that's where the trouble really began for Rodney Ocala.
So Ocala didn't fare well in the Army. He went AWOL a few times, got in some trouble.
As it turns out, this bright, handsome young man with a promising future had nightmarish urges that he refused to ignore.
So 1963, he gets a pass in the military. He ultimately goes to New York. While in New York, he assaults a girl. He hits her over the head with a Coke bottle. That girl was able to run away.
He had sociopathic personality traits. He had no shame, and he didn't feel guilty about anything that he did.
The military felt that he had had a nervous breakdown. That was their analysis of it. The psychiatrists at the hospital felt it was a lot more serious than that. But he was discharged honorably, and not a blemish on his record.
So he ends up coming back to California, where he enrolls in the UCLA Fine Art program as a photography major.
So Rodney Ocala is actually attending UCLA and living less than a mile away from Chateau Marmont when he attacks Tali Shapiro in 1968 and then seems to vanish.
I was pretty much convinced he'd gone to Mexico because he had relatives in Mexico.
So it's been 3 years now since the rape of Tali Shapiro. The FBI eventually became interested in the case and put Rodney Ocala on the 10 most wanted list.
So I get a phone call and it's the FBI in New Hampshire. Say, hey, we've got your guy in custody, Rod B. James Alcala.
It seemed like an open and shut case, but it was just the beginning of what would become a pattern of catch and release that would continue for more than a decade. While the FBI is on the hunt for Rodney Alcala, he's actually living on the East Coast under a name John Berger.
So in 1968, John Berger walks into NYU and applies to their School of the Arts. So there he was in New York, a fugitive, now for 3 years.
What better place to be a sexual predator than to go to a feeding frenzy like New York?
So New York in the early 70s is certainly, from the civic standpoint, rather challenged. It's Mayor Lindsay's second term. He's having a hard time delivering services to people. Garbage. Police feel like they're under siege. Crime is certainly up, violent crime.
And it's during this crime wave in New York City that Ocala is able to fly under the radar, and he strikes again.
Cornelia Crilly grew up in Queens. She had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, Catholic family, very well respected in the neighborhood, had a very happy childhood.
She was beautiful. She had long, beautiful Irish hair and Irish eyes, big smile, very friendly and funny.
A few years after high school, Cornelia met Dream Man, Leon Borstein, and they began dating.
I was 29 or 30. She was probably 23 at the time.
She wanted to become a TWA stewardess. At that time, they were known as ambassadors to the world and had a lot of prestige. And once she was accepted, she got an apartment with a couple of her stewardess friends on East 83rd Street.
In fact, in the east side of Manhattan, an area becomes known as the Girl Belt because for the first time, young women are living on their own and experiencing their careers as they never had in the past.
I had gotten a job in a Brooklyn DA's office. So in the middle of the day, I got a call from her mother saying she couldn't find her. I said, okay, when I leave, I'll go find her. I'm sure she's at the apartment.
Mrs. Crilly was trying to get in touch with her daughter, and she didn't answer the phone.
She was living in a building where I could go in the building without a key. I knocked on the door, and there was no response. That's when I called the cops. And they came over. I was at the front door when they broke into the back window. They opened the door. They told me that she had been killed.
She was down on the floor of her New York apartment. She'd been strangled with nylon stockings and also had bite marks on her breast. She'd been raped and brutally murdered.
We got a call from the police department that somebody still had to identify the body. So I went over to the morgue.
And Crilly case. It's very unique because she just moved in the apartment. She's a new girl. No one knew her. So that was a drawback to the detectives in the beginning.
New York PD has this brutal crime scene and no suspects.
You know, it was 2,000 murders that year. It wasn't peace, love, and joy. Detectives had a lot of dead ends with this case. They had nothing, unfortunately, and the case went cold.
Well, still enrolled as a student at NYU, Rodney Alcala, a.k.a. John Berger, actually spent his summers as a counselor at an arts camp in New Hampshire.
So in August of 1971, two campers take the little dirt road down to the post office, and all of a sudden it starts pouring. They run inside the post office to get cover, and they start looking around to see what is in the post office.
And there's the good old FBI 10 Most Wanted list.
They go from one to the next to the next. Each one looks more horrible than the preceding one.
Look at this, and they're like, hey, that's Mr. Berger.
So they go back to the camp and they tell the head counselor, we saw this 10 Most Wanted poster of somebody who looks like our John Berger. So he said, don't say anything to anyone and I'll go down to the post office and take a look. So he comes back, he calls the FBI, and he says, I think we have your man.
I get a phone call and it's the FBI in New Hampshire. Say, hey, we've got your guy in custody, Rodney James Alcala. I said, you've got him in custody. Fantastic.
This has been 3 years that Alcala has been on the lam and that Hodel has been looking for him.
So on the 12th of August, 1971, I, with a partner, picked him up, took him to the airport, flew him back. We got our guy, he's going to prison for at least 20, 30 years. Parents didn't want Tally to testify. They said it'd be too traumatic.
So I think the big fear was, oh my God, will Alcala get away with it? And what's dangerous in the case of a sociopath is they're very persuasive.
In 1971, Rodney Alcala is arrested in New Hampshire and brought back to LA to finally face charges for the rape and attempted murder of Tally Shapiro.
He was very low-key, kind of came off a bit introverted, but I could see his mind function. And that's what made this guy so dangerous. He was able to read people very well and stay a step or two or three ahead of them. For him, it was all a kind of a chess game.
Rodney Alcala is charged with all the crimes against Tally Shapiro, which included kidnapping, rape, child molestation, and torture.
It turns out that because Tally and her family were in Mexico, the only charge they could put on him was a plea deal for child molestation. No brutality, no bashing, no raping, no almost killing.
And they wound up giving Rodney Alcala a plea deal, where he pled to what's known as an indeterminate sentence. He had 1 year to life in California State Prison.
With an indeterminate sentence, it's sliding, it's not determined. And then the parole board has more flexibility in determining whether someone's been rehabilitated or whether they're a danger to the community. This meant that Rodney Alcala would have yearly parole reviews. And what's dangerous in the case of a sociopath is they're very persuasive.
And he's getting therapy in prison, and they believe that he has shown enough progress that in 34 months, the California Parole Board released Rodney Alcala back into the world.
Not even 3 years. Good behavior, they said. Model prisoner, they said. And he was out on the streets again.
The heartbreaking part of this is that they could have kept him, but in those days, that was an era where they believed so strongly in the power of therapy. But when it comes to fixing psychopaths, it doesn't work.
So Alcala is the luckiest man in the world. He's out on parole, and he's having the best time. He's photographing people, and he one day decides to take a ride, and he starts strolling again.
True to form, 2 months later, Rodney Alcala is caught smoking marijuana on the cliffs of Sunset Beach in Huntington Beach with a 13-year-old girl. And he was caught by park rangers.
So he gets arrested yet again. And this time, he gets 2.5 years, and he's taken to prison.
In June 1977, Rodney Alcala is released again from California State Prison, and he goes in, a different parole officer this time, and he asks for permission to go on some vacations.
And the parole officer miraculously says, sure, go ahead. So Rodney heads off to New York. July 1977 in New York was a difficult time for everyone. It was hot, it was steamy, the garbage wasn't being collected.
And you used to read the newspaper, Daily News or the Post. First 20 pages of just violence, violence, violence. Every day.
lot of murders going on, including Son of Sam.
During the time of Son of Sam in 1977, the city was afraid. Look, you had a lunatic running around, shooting men and women in cars.
Police in New York are on special alert tonight for a psychopathic killer who calls himself Son of Sam.
His favorite targets? Young white women with long dark hair.
During that time, Alcala is taking a lot of photographs. He walks up and down the streets and asks people if he can take their picture. Young boys, young girls, older women, doesn't matter. He just wants to take photographs. And a young woman says, sure, you can take my photograph. And they start talking and they get along. It's very nice. Her name is Ellen Hover.
Ellen was strikingly beautiful. She had long dark hair and long, slender arms and legs, and carried herself like a dancer.
Her father was the owner of Ciro's in Hollywood, a well-known nightclub where Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin and other people appeared.
Ellen was very trusting of other people. She came from a Hollywood family, grew up in Beverly Hills, and then Great Neck, and then Manhattan. Ellen loved people.
On July 13th and 14th was the famous New York City blackout.
This is an ABC News special report.
New York City went totally dark last night, and tonight large parts of the city still are without power.
It's lawlessness. People loot. Crime goes through the roof. People are afraid.
There's no refrigeration, no water, no lights on one of the hottest, steamiest nights of the year in New York City.
It was a very unsettling, hard time for most people.
On July 15th, Ellen Hover goes missing.
That evening, friends tried to get in touch with Ellen. Nobody could.
The phone rang. It was Ellen's mother, Yvonne Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz asked me if I had heard from Ellen since the weekend, and I said no. The next thing I knew, I was watching the 11 o'clock news, and there was Ellen's picture, New York heiress missing.
And the next day, when the police showed up at her door, they looked inside and they found on her calendar there was an entry that said she was meeting John Berger.
New York City went totally dark last night, and tonight large parts of the city still are without power.
Ellen Hover's disappearance was a huge mystery. This was a very big deal, that this socialite, this young woman, was just gone, missing.
There was nothing in her background that suggested that she would have run away.
It's in the New York Times. It's on posters. It's on the news. It's the talk of the town.
When the police showed up at her door, they looked inside.
Nothing looks like an attack happened there. But they collect evidence, mail, notes, things like that. And one of the things they take is her calendar.
And there was an entry that said she was meeting John Berger.
They research back, and they try to ID who John Berger is.
You're talking about a woman who goes missing in New York City pre-computer. And so Rodney Alcala / John Berger was never really on the radar of the New York City Police Department.
So Alcala goes to LA, and he's there actually trying to find a job.
Rodney Alcala gets a job with the Los Angeles Times working as a typesetter.
You have to put this into perspective. On the lam for 3 years, 10 most wanted, 2 stints in jail, felon. He applies under his own name, Rodney Alcala, and he gets the job.
He actually would bring in photographs to show some of the people at his work, and a lot of the photos were of nude girls. And I think it was like the time when people didn't really question it. You weren't like, oh my God, you're a pedophile. Like instead they were like, oh, he's just kind of strange. He's very artsy.
So 5 months after Alcala is returned to LA, the FBI is actually able to connect the dots between Rodney Alcala, the name John Berger, and the notes found in Ellen Hover's calendar. So Rodney Alcala was eventually questioned by the FBI in relation to the disappearance of Ellen Hover, and he admitted being with her.
Where did you meet Ellen? The 15th?
He said he had taken her up to Westchester to take a picture. They had a lovely time, and that was it. Never saw her again.
I think we call like rocking raw. That was it.
At that point, they still had not found a body.
Other than him admitting to the crime, saying, I killed her, there wasn't enough to arrest him.
This is Bill McCreary in North Tarrytown with a story about the discovery of the body of a millionaire's daughter missing for the past 11 months.
Ultimately, she's found. It's almost a year later. She's found up in an area by the Rockefeller estate.
They found clothing of hers nearby. They went back to the same site and they discovered her remains.
But it's all skeletal. She's identified through dental comparison.
Well, police are able to positively identify the remains of Ellen Hover. There is no forensic evidence that leads them to her killer.
The 1970s was considered a serial killer central.
You have the Hillside Strangler, the Night Stalker, 2 freeway killers. You have the Bedroom Basher. Elsewhere, you have Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy killing people in Chicago.
Recently, there's been a rash of mass shootings.
1977 through 1978, many women were murdered.
Police in this era are lacking a lot of the investigative tools they have today. There's no DNA. There's no surveillance camera around every corner. People aren't walking around with a GPS in their
All of these things lead to this sort of perfect storm for Rodney Alcala, where he's able to remain one step ahead of police, and he goes on the hunt for more victims, and there's absolutely nothing to stop him.
Jill Barkham was a 19-year-old girl in New York who was adventuresome and wanted to take a trip with a friend of hers. And so she left New York for Los Angeles.
Jill and I were very close as children growing up. We were often mistaken as twins. Jill had a very free spirit about her.
Bruce was very sad when she left New York, was very scared for her, being so young at 19 years old.
So November 10th, 1977, I called home and there was crying in the background. They said, you need to come home. You need to come home. And that's all they would say.
Jill Barkham was found off of Franklin Canyon Road, and it was down the street from Marlon Brando's home at the time. She was found bent over, half naked. Her head was facing the dirt.
She has multiple ligatures on her neck. It was a brutal crime scene.
I came into a house of siblings distraught, righteously so, and heard it from my mother directly that my sister was dead.
Her face was unrecognizable. Her brother said at the funeral that he couldn't even recognize his sister. It was so mutilated.
I had night terrors the day that Jill's body arrived. It wasn't just murder, it wasn't just rape, it was brutal, it was sadistic. And nobody could understand why the things happened to her.
They thought perhaps this could be the work of the Hillside Strangler because that's what the Hillside Strangler did. Strangle women and left them on the side of the road.
And it complicated this investigation because Jill Barkham had a friend when she got out to LA that was actually abducted and murdered by the Hillside Strangler.
In the end, the police were unable to link the murder of Jill Barkham to the Hillside Strangler, and the case just went cold. That meant the string of murders of young girls and women continued.
Georgia Wickstead was 27 years old. She was absolutely gorgeous. She was a nurse that worked for cardiac care.
She was from Los Angeles. She worked out of the Centinela Hospital and just recently moved to Malibu.
Every morning she would pick up another nurse and they would drive to the hospital together to do their shift. And one morning she didn't show up.
So the police were called to do a welfare check of her in her home. It was discovered that her window was open and the screen was removed. When the police entered her home, there was blood everywhere. Her body was completely naked and strewn on the floor, kind of posed open.
The viciousness and the sadism involved in her murder is so disturbing and so profound.
There was a handprint that was found on the brass bedding, but there was no one to match the palm print to. And again, that case went cold.
And the third person who was found dead in the same way as the other two was Charlotte Lamb.
Charlotte Lamb, in 1978, was a legal secretary living in the Santa Monica area. She had called some friends one night to go out and go dancing in Santa Monica. Her friends decided not to go. Her body was later found in El Segundo, miles away, in an apartment complex she had no connection to.
She had been strangled and she'd been brutally raped and murdered. Her arms had been folded behind her back, which made her back arch to expose her breasts. She'd been posed. It's just very disturbing and incredibly sad.
I met with Rodney 5 or 6 times. I administered assessments with regard to his sexual interests. Many times the rapist, killer, antisocial person will pose dead bodies, and they do want law enforcement and other people to see this. And there's a message in that. The message for Rodney is that I am here, you will remember me.
So instead of hiding in the shadows, Rodney Alcala is almost fearless, and he puts himself out there in perhaps the most public way possible.
Rodney going on Dating Game is a great example of him being predatory, him being confident, narcissistic, and of course he wouldn't go on unless he would win.
And 5, 4, 3.
He always wins.
Factor number 1 is a successful photographer. You might find him skydiving or motorcycling. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Please welcome Rodney Alcala.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes?
What's your best time?
Nighttime's when it really gets good.
In retrospect, it has got to be one of the creepiest moments on TV.
He says, I always get my girl.
The so-called dating game killer is one of the country's most notorious criminals.
They told us that they had found Robin. It was devastating.
There's nothing hurts like that. Nothing.
Her plan was to shoot Alcala. She wanted to avenge her daughter.
He was a sadistic killer who deserved death. Model prisoner, they said. He was out on the streets again.
A pattern of catch and release that would continue for more than a decade.
All these pictures that the police had from a serial killer. His victims are still out there.
So by 1978, the body count is piling up. Rodney Alcala has murdered at least 5 women on 2 coasts and almost murdered a little girl, and he's just about to make his primetime debut.
In the 70s, I was the executive producer and Ellen was the contestant coordinator. The show that Rodney Alcala appeared on aired in September 1978.
The dating game appearance is just a bizarre part about this case. I think that what it reflects is the narcissism and ego and the arrogance of a serial killer. So he actually tries out for Chuck Berry Productions and becomes a bachelor for the dating game.
Very striking. I don't know, there was a boldness about him, and he had long black hair. He was just a striking looking person.
In terms of putting him on as a contestant, I think on the form I wrote NW, which was my symbol for no way, no darn way, is this guy going to be on the show? Because I noticed that he had a very strange personality.
It's like, are you kidding? He's so attractive. Everyone's going to love him. All the women are going to love him.
And I said, all right, we'll put him on the show, but we've got to surround him with 2 guys that have personalities and that are respectable and decent and fun.
My name is Jed Mills. When I got the job on the dating game, they said you're going to be bachelor number 2, so you'll be sitting in the center. Bachelor number 1 is a little creepy. Notice that right away. In the green room, he jumps in. He says, I always get my girl.
Number 1, would you say hello to Cheryl, please? We're going to have a good time together, Cheryl.
Immediately did not like this guy.
And here we go.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes?
What's your best time?
One of our edicts was to make the show much sexier and much more provocative than the show in the 60s. Everything was sexy in the 70s. So we pushed the envelope.
The best time is at night. Nighttime's when it really gets good.
The sexual innuendo intrigued the audience. They loved it, and they started clapping. Yeah, they loved this guy.
Oddly enough, 42 years later, I still remember Cheryl Bradshaw. She did voices.
And she says, suppose I was auditioning you for a private class, and you're a dirty old man.
You're a dirty old man. Take it.
Come on, over here.
In retrospect, it has got to be one of the creepiest moments on TV.
The audience is beside themselves. They love this.
Cheryl Bradshaw asked about what kind of food he would be if she was going to serve him for dinner.
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
In retrospect, it sounds horrible, but at the time, we were looking for raunchy, sexy answers, and that was one. Taken in context now, oh my God.
Rodney's motives for going on the dating game are, in my opinion, part of his personality disorder. He wants a lot of attention and he believes he should have it. He's quite bright and he wants the world to know who he is.
When it became time for the Bachelorette to choose number 1, number 2, or number 3, she said,
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number 1. Number 1. All right. This is your date, Rodney Alcala. Rodney, come on,
She seemed very excited about seeing him. And when he came around, I would say it was a pretty lukewarm togetherness.
She called the office the next day and spoke to Ellen.
She said, Ellen, I can't go out with this guy. There's weird vibes that are coming off of him. He's very strange. I'm not comfortable. Is that going to be a problem? And of course I said no.
I would be very interested in knowing what happened in the days after when the person who chose him would not date him.
Jill Parento was a 21-year-old college student and data entry worker. She lived in an apartment by herself.
On June 13th, she went to a Dodger game and came home and was never heard from again.
The next day, she never showed up at work.
When law enforcement entered her home, she was found in her bedroom. Her body was lying next to the bed, very similar to Charlotte Lamb's, where she was laid on her back, fully naked. She had a pillow up behind her back that propped her breasts up.
So this is, again, another avoidable set of killings by this guy that should have stayed in prison. But he didn't even break stride on the continued crimes that he committed.
My mom's plan was to shoot Alcala.
In those days, they didn't have metal detectors and they didn't use them, so she got into the courtroom.
She really didn't care about anything else at that point. She wanted to avenge her daughter.
In 1979, Rodney was living at his mother's house. He had a separate entrance, and perhaps he lived there because he didn't have to pay any rent.
He had taken a lot of nude photos, and he would send these photos to New York and get paid for them. They would go into pornography magazines. That's what he did.
Not only was Rodney on the lam for 3 years, 10 most wanted, 34 months in prison for tally, 2.5 years in prison for a felony of giving drugs to a minor. He's out. He's free. He's on the prowl again.
On June 20th, 1979, Rodney Alcala leaves his mother's house and drives to Huntington Beach. And he starts in a place called Sunset Beach, which is a little bit north on Pacific Coast Highway. And he runs into a 17-year-old girl on roller skates named Lori Wirtz.
I was with my friend Patty, and we decided to go to Sunset Beach. We were approached by Alcala.
And he says, I'm a photographer, and hey, if you could just, skate this way, I'll take some photos.
And I said, oh, that's okay, I'll just help him out.
And there's a series of these photographs that are taken by Rodney Alcala. He was a formally trained photographer, which really played into his method of luring these women and young girls into vulnerable positions.
It's my opinion with regard to Rodney that deviant behavior is always preceded by deviant fantasy. The taking the pictures, going around looking for little girls, sizing people up.
It's a part of the constellation of the Rodney Alcala killing machine. The encounter with Lori Wirtz is very important for two different reasons. Number one, it shows that he's actually down in Huntington Beach that day, which he later denies. And it also shows that he's actively hunting for his next victim.
He was asking me all kinds of questions, like where I'm from, my name, my age. He tried really hard to get me in the car. He tried to get me in the car and leave my friend on the beach.
She doesn't bite, won't get in his car.
He started to drive away, and I did see that he was driving toward Huntington Beach.
Huntington Beach in 1979 in June was chock full of kids and sunbathers and rollerbladers and people walking on boardwalks and just having fun.
The vibe in Huntington Beach back in the 70s was pretty easygoing. You felt safe.
Robin Samso was a 12-year-old, blonde, blue-eyed poster child for athleticism and healthy lifestyle.
I'm Robin's oldest sister. We are 2 of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls.
Robin was the baby of the family. Her brothers, sisters, mother all doted over Robin.
She always had a spirit about her. I mean, everybody that met her fell in love with her.
Rodney Alcala winds up on the beach talking to Bridget Wilbert and Robin Samso.
When Robin and I crossed 14th Street is when I believe he spotted us.
And what he's doing is he's saying, hey, I'm a photographer, you're beautiful, you could be a model, how about you let me take pictures?
And I was having none of it. I was like, no. And he reached out and put his hand on Robin's leg. And that's when I grabbed her. I said, like, no, this isn't good.
So one of the moms comes over and is like, who are you? Why are you talking to him? And he scurries off like a cockroach.
Robin had to be at a dance class at 4 o'clock, so she and Bridget went back to Bridget's house.
It was time for Robin to be going because she needed to be in the ballet studio to answer phones. That was how she paid for her ballet. Robin was running late, so Bridget let her use her bike. Go get my bike. I said, and don't stop. It was very important to me to say that.
He's in his car. He had maps to Southern California. He had blacked out windows. He had this rolling trap to try to get people in it.
And then my house phone rang. It was one of Robin's brothers. And he said, is Robin still with you? Has she left? Because she hasn't shown up to ballet.
And there's not a sign of anything. No bike, no person on the side of the road, nothing.
Mom began to worry, and still an hour or so later, when Robin still hadn't returned, she called the police to file a missing persons report.
That was my mom's baby, and my mom cried every day.
Bridget was later introduced to a sketch artist to compile a composite of the individual they'd been talking to on the beach.
And when I was done, I was like, that's him. That is him.
It's Rodney Alcala. I mean, you look at that, and it's Rodney Alcala.
Approximately 12 days after Robin went missing, a park ranger in the Sierra Madres at a location called Chantry Flats located some human remains.
But she's been scavenged. And what that means is animals have eaten her.
During their search of the area, they also found a shoe that was identified as belonging to Robin and a beach towel.
And that's how they found this beautiful 12-year-old girl.
I remember I was laying on the couch, and the doorbell rang. And I answered the door, and it was the police. They came in, and they told us that they had found Robin. And my mom broke down, as well as everybody else, my brothers and I. It was devastating.
Her mother, wanted to see her daughter's body, and they had to explain to her that there is no body. There's a skull and there's bones.
My mom she was never the same. It's like her life just had this big empty hole, and everybody else was just on the outside looking in.
They arrest Rodney Alcala at his mother's house in Monterey Park.
After that, they obtained a search warrant for his mother's residence where he was living.
They inside Rodney Alcala's residence, and they see a receipt for a self-storage facility in the city of Seattle. So, in really good heads-up police work. Paperwork is not a part of the search warrant, so they cannot collect it. But it's in plain sight, so they write down the information.
One of his sisters went to visit Alcala in jail, and they started talking about the storage locker.
And Rodney Alcala is overheard saying words to the effect of, well, it's good that they don't know about the storage locker.
cops actually overheard the conversation.
And they get inside and they find a treasure trove of evidence. I mean, it breaks the case. They arrest Rodney Alcala, they bring him to Huntington Beach, and they interview him. Can you show around the After the police interview him, he's very savvy and he gives up very little information and he essentially denies all wrongdoing. They get up to this storage locker in the city of Seattle.
They find thousands of pictures of young people, older people, all kinds of people in compromised positions.
They also find various forms of jewelry, a bunch of different earrings and little keepsakes. Those are trophies.
For Rodney, it's his vehicle for power and control. That's why he keeps things.
I remember them asking my mom to the police department to come and identify some things that they found at a locker in Washington.
Two of the earrings found were gold ball earrings. Robin was described as wearing those earrings on the day that she disappeared.
In 1980, Rodney Alcala was tried for the murder of Robin Samsoe.
One of the stories that Marianne Connolly, Robin's mom, told was that during the 1980 case, she actually showed up with a gun.
Her plan was to shoot Alcala. She really didn't care about anything else at that point. She wanted to avenge her daughter.
In those days, they didn't have metal detectors and they didn't use them, so she got into the courtroom.
I remember she was very calm. She just kept saying, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay.
The trial began, and she had her hand on her purse, and she was ready to kill the man who had murdered her daughter.
I do remember her telling me that she heard Robin's voice and told her not to do it. So she had changed her mind.
On May 8th, 1980, the jury on the Robin Samsoe case deliberated less than 5 hours.
Rodney Alcala was convicted and sentenced to death. He was taken to San Quentin, where he was put on death row. Several years later, an appeal came up. And to everyone's shock and sorrow and horror, the case was repealed.
The verdict was overturned by the California Supreme Court because the justices determined that the jurors in the trial had been improperly informed of Alcala's prior sex crimes.
I think that there's been a gross miscarriage of justice for being found guilty of something that I didn't do.
In 1984, we learned that Alcala was getting a new trial. Once again, my mother was completely destroyed.
Just can't believe that we have to be punished for what he did. And that's really what it amounts to. We're the ones that are being punished. It means nothing to him.
In the 1986 retrial of Rodney Alcala, a new prosecutor was assigned. He was very confident in his ability to be able to get a conviction on that. 7 years to the day of Robin Samsoe's disappearance, the second jury convicted Rodney Alcala and also recommended that he be sentenced to die.
The second time he was found guilty, and he got the death penalty again. And we were extremely happy.
One would think that's the end. He's now going to spend the rest of his life on death row until he gets executed. Well, that wasn't the case. In 2001, Rodney's death penalty was again overturned.
At this point, it's important to remember that Rodney Alcala has been in custody ever since being accused of murdering Robin Samsoe in '79. He's now 58 years old, and life behind bars has taken its toll, not only on Rodney Alcala, but also on the victims' families who've been trying to achieve justice.
Twice Alcala has been convicted and sentenced to death. Twice the convictions were reversed on appeal.
The main reason was an ineffective assistance of counsel claim, meaning that Rodney's attorney had not put forth a strong enough defense on his behalf.
My mom really kind of lost it then.
Every time this happens, it's like losing Robin all over again. I don't know if you've ever lost a child, but there's nothing that hurts like that. Nothing.
Amazingly, at this point, Rodney Alcala has escaped the death penalty 2 times, and now these victims and these families are going to be turning to me and my team to ensure that he's punished for this once and for all. This case was assigned to me back in 2003 when my boss came in and essentially gave me the rundown on it and said that it was going to be a tough one.
That's when Matt Murphy decided to go back to the evidence. He had that pouch of jewelry that was recovered in the Seattle storage locker reanalyzed for DNA.
Which meant that Rodney's DNA could be put up against the DNA that had been taken decades earlier from the people whom we all believed he had murdered. The DNA matched Charlotte Lamb, Jill Parento, Georgia Wickstead, and Jill Barkham.
At that point, Rodney Alcala is clearly now known as a serial killer.
When you get a case like this, the first thing you do is you meet with the family members, and it really drives you. And they say you see the reflection of your victim in the eyes of the people who love them.
I forget a lot of things, except the most important thing I can't forget, and that's her, and how she died.
I was at the same exact age as Robin Sampson. We were both 12 years old in 1979, and you connect with your victim.
Matt Murphy was a young, talented, brilliant prosecutor, and the Alcala case would be his 107th homicide.
And now we're going to be in one of my courts in front of one of my judges, and I was going to do everything I could to make sure that he faced justice for what he did.
The third death penalty trial was set for 2010.
Matt Murphy and I ended up being co-counsel on the case once we brought our LA cases down to Orange County.
So we had all these really good professionals that came together.
I came to know Rodney Alcala by being on the Orange County panel of expert witnesses. I met with Rodney. We met a total of 18 hours over a number of days.
And this third time around, 66-year-old Rodney Alcala decides he'll represent himself.
He is a narcissist. He has a genius IQ measured by some. So he's very brilliant and thinks that translates into being able to be a good lawyer for himself in the case.
Alcala's choice to represent himself was a message to Mr. Murphy that he is equal to him. Mr. Alcala's perceptions about his own superiority should never, ever be underestimated.
She's been gagged with a t-shirt shoved down her mouth. I wanted the jury to see the level of violence because one of the things that we needed to prove was torture, so that we needed to prove he intended to inflict pain on these victims.
Alcala would strangle the women into unconsciousness, wait till they wake up, and then strangle them again. He knew exactly what he's doing, and he enjoyed what he was doing.
So these are the facts of the Sampson case.
Because Rodney Alcala was representing himself, he got to cross-examine the witnesses. And then, of course, question Robin Sampson's mom.
This is what they look like.
He was questioning my mother about the earrings, trying to create doubt. Alcala tried to argue with my mother.
All the jury sees is the man who murdered this poor woman's daughter cross-examining her.
It was so hard watching her that I think the three of us just sat there and sobbed.
Robin Sampson's day in court is today. You make sure that he is held responsible for what happened to that little girl.
Murphy in his closing arguments, they were fantastic.
He got her into his car, and he drove her up to those mountains. And Rodney Alcala smashed her face in, but she was still alive. He brutalized her.
He was rattled after my closing argument. Because that's when he first learned, he wasn't as smart as he thought he was.
The day the verdict was read, the courtroom was very still and very quiet.
We, the jury, further find and affix the degree thereof, murder in the first degree.
The verdict was guilty on all charges, across the board, all 5 murders. The evidence that we put in for the penalty phase of the trial focused largely on his prior sexual assaults of Tally Shapiro.
When When Matt reached out to me in 2010, he was pretty adamant that he really needed me to come forth and help put Alcala away.
So now we've come full circle from 68 to 79. So bringing Tally Shapiro in as the one who lived, as the one who got away, is very important for a jury to see what a monster Rodney Alcala is.
I was there for the Samso family. I've never been the victim. I've always been the survivor.
If you decide that the death penalty is appropriate punishment, you shouldn't feel too good about it.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury went back to deliberate one more time, and they came back with a verdict in a little less than 2 hours.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, determine that the penalty to be imposed upon defendant Rodney James Alcala to be death.
I feel like Robin's life meant something, even in 12 years. She stopped him from killing anybody else. And I believe that if you would have told her that God was going to use her for this purpose, she would have been okay with it.
I just pray that I live long enough to watch him be executed. I only wish that I could be the one to administrate the injection.
In 2019, the state of California placed a moratorium on the death penalty. So that meant that all prisoners on death row, and this included Rodney Alcala, received a stay of execution. This did mean, though, that Robin Samso's mother would not see Rodney Alcala executed.
July 23rd, 2019, my mom passed away. She wanted to see that day that Alcala leaves this earth, that he just does not breathe anymore. And it's unfair. It's unfair. Somebody so cruel and evil.
Cold case investigators tonight saying they have solved 2 of New York's most notorious murders.
New York had been investigating cases involving Rodney Alcala, a murder in 1971 and a murder in 1977.
Although Alcala is already on death row in California, he will be extradited here to go on trial for killing the 2 New York women.
They decided to charge Rodney with the 2 New York murders.
He conceded that he did kill the 2 women in question. I was surprised that he pled guilty. I think ultimately he knew he was going to be convicted. Mr. Alcala got 25 years to life, which is the highest sentence under the law.
After the trial, the Huntington Beach Police Department released hundreds of the photos that they found in that Seattle locker to the general public. Police don't know if any of the people in these pictures were victims of Alcala, but hope the public might be able to help identify them.
After the Huntington Beach Police Department released those photographs, the decades-old mystery of Christine Thornton was about to come full circle.
My son sent this email to me with all these pictures in it that the police had from a serial killer. That was her. That was definitely her. I think, having Christine being gone for so long, it was difficult because, we all knew that something bad had happened to her.
For nearly 40 years, Christine Thornton's family assumed she was dead. She just vanished out of their lives.
In 82, this herder out in the middle of nowhere comes across a pile of bones, obviously human remains. Several initial deputies responded along with detectives, and what they found was it was a body of a 25 to 35-year-old female. They also found the bones of an unborn child mixed in, largely all intact. The clothing was still there, even some jewelry were all located. They couldn't determine a cause of death. What they believed was that it was possibly strangulation because one of the pant legs was tied in a ligature. The detectives at that time they used the skull and sent it off to the crime lab in order to get a reconstruction of what they felt this person looked like. They determined that it was a young female and brunette. They unfortunately weren't able to identify her, and the case went cold. In 2013, several of the detectives, including myself, were assigned
specific cold cases. So this box was almost falling apart when I initially was assigned this case. There was still bone fragment and skin tissue saved at the crime lab after all those years.
If you have DNA, you run it. And then you try to find out by sending it down through CODIS and missing persons to find out if you can get a match.
CODIS refers to the Combined DNA Index System. It was created in 1998. DNA is entered into a national database, and this helps the authorities find missing people and also solve crimes.
I was basically told it was now a waiting game. I honestly thought I'd be 10, 20 years retired before I'd get a phone call saying that they'd identified her.
So in 2013, my son sent an email to me knowing that he had an aunt that he had never met. He knew the story, that she went missing, and he came across this article with all these pictures in it that the police had from a serial killer.
Her son found the website that had all the pictures that they found in Alcala's locker up in Seattle.
She looked through all these photographs and kept stopping at that one photograph of a beautiful brunette seated on the back of a motorcycle.
And I'm like, I think that's Chris. And sure enough, I looked at her little pinky toe, which I remember. It just was very distinctive. It curled up on her other toes, and I kind of knew that was her. That was definitely her.
At that point is when she decided to submit her DNA sample as a reference to hopefully identify Christine.
Detective Sheeman came to my office to tell me that they had a match and an identification.
Just shy of 2 years later is when I was off duty. I decided to check my email. The email I received identified my victim from Granger as Christine Ruth Thornton.
So this is the copy of the photo that was found in Rodney Alcala's possession. Trying to match this photo out in the Granger Prairie seems almost impossible, but we were able to match this photograph up just based off of two different ridges. You can actually hold this picture up and actually show that this is almost the exact area that this photograph potentially was taken back in 1977. And here we are in 2020. It was pretty shocking to find this area and to know what transpired here all those years ago.
We spoke to detectives with the Huntington Beach Police Department and put a timeline together.
So in July of 1977, with the permission of his parole officer, he's allowed to travel back to New York. And Rodney Alcala wasn't flying. Rodney Alcala was driving. So Rodney Alcala leaves New York, comes back to Los Angeles,
and we determined around the time that Christine was killed, he had been traveling across the nation. The motorcycle was actually owned by Rodney Alcala, and they were able to find that motorcycle in his possession.
There's no rhyme or reason how these two people, one so good and one not, cross paths and end up there.
I thought we had enough evidence to possibly charge him, but before we did that, I wanted to speak with him.
I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews in my career, but I told myself, how the hell do you interview a serial killer?
It's 2016, 6 years after Rodney Alcala has been convicted for the murders of Robin Samso and the other women. He's 73 years old and his health is failing. He's confined to a bed at Corcoran State Prison, and that's where Wyoming officials come to confront him for the murder of Christine Thornton.
As we got in there, it was dingy-colored peach in Alcala's medical cell.
It was like something off a horror movie, paint peeling off the walls, flies buzzing around the room. It's something that I'll never forget, seeing him lying in his bed. And I remember looking at him going, this is him. I identified myself, read him his rights, and we started pulling out photographs of the original crime scene.
Now he knew why we were there.
This area look familiar? What do you mean by part of your area?
I couldn't believe it. It's almost like it's his killing field. We also showed Rodney Alcala the picture of Christine seated on the back of his motorcycle, and it gives me chills even today to remember his reaction.
Talk to me about the picture. What picture? The picture that you're pointing at. What's on your mind? Talk to me. God, talk to me. Tell me about that girl.
He took his finger and he started tracing her body on the photograph. And then he started tapping on the photograph and kept doing that for a couple more minutes.
That's a guy who wants to relive it again. It empowers him, right? He would relive that.
You could see his eyes moving in his eyelids, almost like he had relived that moment. That entire moment for however long it lasted with Christine out in the desert.
Do you know her? Yes or no? You remember taking this picture? Yes. Okay. Now the question is, Mr. Alcala, how did she end up dead? Did you kill her? Yes or no, sir?
When it comes to the big question, he's not going to give it to you. But we got him to admit that he was there. And we got him to admit that he knew Christine. And that's all we needed.
So Rodney Alcala was eventually charged with first-degree murder in Sweetwater County, Wyoming.
They informed me that he was not able to travel without great expense. And so I made the decision that I was not going to try to bring Alcala back to stand trial in Wyoming.
Best place for Rodney Alcala is exactly where we left it. Seeing that jail cell and that setup that he's in, he's where he needs to be.
It was disappointing that we weren't going to get a conviction on her murder, but the good thing about all of this is that this man has been brought to light as being a serial killer. His victims are still out there.
Over the years, Rodney Alcala was given multiple opportunities to disclose those victims, whether part of plea deals, to avoid the death penalty, but he continuously refused to give up that information.
He has memories that he has kept secret from everyone.
That power gives him gratification, and him having the information on victims and us not knowing it, that's something he wants to take to his grave.
Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches, and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide, and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. Bakhtiar Hakim was an Indian doctor who came over to England and recreated himself as a respected Lancaster GP. On today's Murder by the Sea, we're going back to the 1930s to find out how overconfident murderer was caught out by new forensic techniques. This double murder took place in Lancaster, close to Morecambe Bay.
The ancient city of Lancaster sits on the River Lune, 4 miles from Morecambe, which for 150 years has been one of Britain's most popular seaside resorts.
And it was in the nearby town of Lancaster that respected GP Buck Ruxton set up his medical practice. But Ruxton wasn't everything he seemed to be.
Well, he wasn't known as Buck Ruxton when he was born. His name was Bukhtar Rustomji Ratanji Hakim, and he was born in Mumbai in 1899 to quite a well-to-do Indian family, and he trained to be a doctor and was very successful and worked for the Indian Medical Service, but he was very ambitious, always very ambitious, and wanted to move to the UK to take surgeon's exams and work here. So he married in 1925 in India and then came over here in 1926, came up to Edinburgh to take his surgeon's exams at the Royal College of Surgeons.
He applied for membership of the Royal College of Surgeons, essentially asking to be licensed as a surgeon, but he failed the exams and so didn't get his license. Despite that, the General Medical Council, on the strength of his Indian qualifications, gave him permission to set up in business as a doctor, a GP, a local family doctor serving local communities.
Getting permission to practice as a doctor wasn't the only thing Buck Ruxton achieved in Edinburgh. Whilst in the city, he also met Isabella Kerr.
When he first met Isabella, he, I think, was probably viewed in Edinburgh as really being quite exotic. He was a very good-looking man, and he called himself Gabriel Hakim. It was only later that he changed name to Buck Ruxton, but by the time they moved to Lancaster and he set up as a GP, he was called Buck Ruxton. And by the early 1930s, they had Buck and Belle. He called her, although she was Isabella, he always called her Belle. Buck and Belle had 3 children. And he was a very respected GP. She was a very, very bubbly personality. She was really an unusual woman, Belle was, because when he met her, she was a driver. Now, not many women in the late 1920s, early 30s drove cars. So she was a driver. She was a very ebullient personality. She used to bet on the horses a great deal. She was a gambler, and she used to want to run her own betting shop business. So, and they had a very intense relationship.
There was more to Isabella Ruxton than met the eye. She wasn't, in the way that she would have been viewed at the time, a respectable young middle-class woman, now married to a respectable middle-class doctor. Isabella was a recent divorcee, then something very much frowned upon by polite society, and her supposed second marriage to Buck Ruxton had never actually taken place. She was instead, and in the parlance of the time, his common-law wife.
I think Buck Ruxton kind of enjoyed the fact that he was different, that he came from a different background, that he did things differently, and that's kind of reflected again in his relationship with Isabella, that I think he probably enjoyed that feeling of people not really knowing him, of thinking they knew him, but at the same time he knew what he really was. But also he's playing a role. He's kind of, even in his choice of name, you can tell that he's not playing by the rules, that he's kind of acting a part.
I don't know lots of people have this kind of, personal versus private character. His was quite different in terms of, what the image that he portrayed to the person that he actually was. But he did it very well. So he was able to integrate himself into the community with relative ease. But he was very intelligent, very likeable individual, and he was able to take on this kind of almost like a character, if you like, and people accepted that because he was able to pull it off to quite a convincing degree.
Just like his marriage, Buck Ruxton wasn't all he seemed. A troubled mind was at play behind his carefully crafted public persona. He's very much presenting himself as a matinee idol, as one of these popular film stars, and he's a very glamorous creature. He is good looking, and appears very confident. He's got a certain swagger about him, and you can imagine that if someone like this turns up in Lancaster in the 1930s, people are going to by him. And the fact that he is a successful doctor, that he's treating the local residents so well, that he's generous towards the poor, you can see how he would have a lot of fans in the local community.
He set up his practice in his home at 2 Dalton Square, a terrace of nice, respectable, middle-class homes in a nice, respectable part of the city. And his practice thrived. The couple hired a young nanny. Mary Jane Rogerson was in her early 20s. She came from Morecambe, the seaside town just 4 miles away from Lancaster itself. And she moved in to the family home and Ruxton practice at 2 Dalton Square. To all outward appearances, it was a typical, respectable, middle-class, happy family. In reality, life in the Ruxton household behind closed doors was very far from that.
Belle and Buck had a very volatile relationship, and I think you'd probably say that the very things that attracted Belle to Buck were the things that created the tensions. So while he was very attracted to somebody who was ebullient and very social, he became increasingly jealous and quite paranoid about her sociability. And there were episodes of violence. Although Belle reported a number of incidents of domestic violence to the police, no action was taken about that.
Buck Ruxton was a violent, controlling, and abusive man, and he was or became convinced that Isabella was carrying on affairs, sexual relationships outside the home. His suspicions, his jealousy led to rows, violent rows. There were and would be numerous reports in the files of Lancaster Police in which constables had been called to 2 Dalton Square to separate the arguing parties. And in one of these incidents, Ruxton had confided in the constable that he felt like murdering his wife because of her infidelity. Isabella's mental health certainly suffered. She developed quite severe mental illness, and there is a record of at least 1 suicide attempt when she tried to kill herself using household gas. She was unsuccessful.
It feels like a very typical household for the time. You have the man who has the respectable job, and then you have the wife who's got the children, the childcare responsibilities. And yet it's not a typical situation, in terms of Isabella not being his legal wife. They are living together. She has had his children out of wedlock, which at the time, was still not what you did, particularly as a middle-class individual. So they are appearing to be this typical family, but actually they're not stereotypical. And I think that explains a lot about the relationship between them. It's an uneven relationship because Isabella risks, if the situation regarding her and Buck not being married is made known, that makes her vulnerable in society. So he has this position of power over her, because it wouldn't be the same for a man who's exposed as living with a woman who's not his wife. A lot of the criticism would go towards Isabella. So she's immediately in that kind of vulnerable position where she has to kind of go along with whatever he does to maintain that semblance of being a respectable married couple. Buck Ruxton is a fascinating individual to study. Having gone from working as a doctor in India under his original name, he then emigrates to the UK, goes under another name, then finally becomes Buck Ruxton, and almost as though he sees it as this traditional English name, and to me it sounds far more American and quite exotic in itself. But he has this idea of what it means to be British and a success story, and so he kind of creates a stereotype and tries to act as though he is this very English creature, a very English doctor, but it's all a complete myth.
So within this life that he's created for himself, there are some cracks which start to appear between him and his wife, and this character that he's created for himself, this lifestyle that he's created for himself, is starting to show that it's not quite as Bed of Roses that he's trying to portray. So in this situation, what he's trying to do really is limit the possibility of this all going wrong for him, and his wife having an affair would certainly have started to expose him certain flaws in his character and flaws in this narrative that he's created around his lifestyle.
It became much more difficult for him to control his increasing paranoia. He particularly felt that Bell was having an affair with a young solicitor who worked for the council. Now, there's no evidence that he was at all. Bell was making a trip to Edinburgh with the solicitor's family, and a row ensued about that. And in fact, Buck followed them up to Edinburgh, drove up behind, well, a couple of hours later, I guess, up to Edinburgh, and there was a big row at the hotel where they were staying, and he left. But he simmered on that, and I feel that the incident that weekend contributed to the events the following weekend.
Late on the night of September the 14th, 1935, the simmering tensions and violence behind the closed doors of 2 Dalton Square finally erupted, fatally. Isabella had been out that evening. She'd been to visit the Blackpool Illuminations, one of Britain's most famous and popular tourist attractions 40 miles down the coast. When she got home, probably around midnight, Ruxton accused her of being visiting a lover, of having sex with somebody else while he stayed at home with the children. The row went from heated to violent.
What appears to have happened is that she came into the house, went up to the top floor, they had a row. He attacked her, either he strangled her and or hit her on the head.
And Ruxton stabbed Isabella in the chest 5 times with a knife.
What Buck Ruxton hadn't counted on was there was a witness to his murder.
Mary Jane Rogerson, the live-in nanny and maid, walked in on this scene.
Having walked in on this dreadful scene, Mary's fate was sealed. Ruxton strangled her, bludgeoned her with a blunt object, and then stabbed her to death. Mary Jane had witnessed the crime. She'd come into the room where it was occurring, and he didn't want to leave a witness, and so he killed her as well. She was unlucky about being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
After he'd killed them, he had to decide how to deal with them. So he pretty immediately decided that the way to deal with them was to dissect the bodies.
Ruxton knew that sawing through bone would make a lot of noise and might wake his children.
He deposited his 3 children with a friend in Lancaster and then went back to Dalton Square and began carving up the bodies of Isabella and Mary Jane into small pieces.
Newly dead bodies are likely to produce a lot of blood, but as a doctor, Ruxton knew this and what steps to take to reduce the risk.
First of all, he bled Bell's body. It's just much easier to be able to do a dissection and less messy if the body is bled. The dissection of Bell's body probably took about 8 hours. The dissections in the bath upstairs. He didn't just dissect it, he cut it up into many, many parts and removed any distinguishing features or all distinguishing features. So in Bell's body, he removed all the sexual organs. He removed teeth because she'd had quite a lot of dental work. He removed a foot because she'd had quite a prominent bunion. He removed all her fingertips because he would be aware of things like fingerprinting, and her body was dissected and disfigured.
At this time in the 1930s, then things like fingerprints would have been one of the main ways in which people were identified. We didn't have DNA technology that we have today. So because of that, if you start to remove those features, if you start to remove the face, things that we naturally need to identify people, then it makes the identification of the bodies exceptionally difficult.
He then tackled Mary's body. Now, he hadn't had time to bleed her body, so it was a more difficult dissection. And by this time, it was morning, so he was having to stop people coming to the house. So he bundled, my understanding is that he bundled both the bodies into the bedroom and then had to stop some of the cleaners and the housekeepers arriving because they would notice.
Whilst Buxton could put off the cleaners, one thing he couldn't stop was the delivery of his daily paper, the Sunday Graphic. When he answered the door, it was evident that he had a nasty gash on his hand, which he explained away as having cut himself whilst opening a tin can.
When he went back to continue with the dissection of Mary's body, he was quite harassed and he'd had a large cut to his hand. So the dissection of her body, although it was still significant, was not as expertly done. But having said that, he still removed a lot of body parts, and he significantly, with Mary's body, she had got a birthmark on her leg, and he removed the skin that might indicate where that birthmark was. So, he was clearly thinking ahead about and minimising what might happen if these body parts were found.
Certainly having that surgical knowledge would have allowed him to perhaps disconnect himself from the act of dismemberment, because he would be familiar with the anatomy and familiar with the sight of blood as an example. So I'm certain that gave him some kind of objectivity and to approach this in a much more methodical way than perhaps a chaotic reaction to a death.
Certainly this isn't something that people can do lightly. It's not even people who are trained as doctors and surgeons to cut up the body of your wife and your maid is not something which is easily done in terms of the emotional attachment. But what it would show really is that he has this kind of callous disregard for these people, even though he's murdered them. And it could be in a fit of rage, it could have been a premeditated incident, but still he has no regard for them as people, and it's just something he's going to get rid of, just like he would his rubbish.
I don't think he loved Isabella. He liked doing this pretense of being a happy British couple and a family. It was all for appearances. There was no real love there at all. And it is quite shocking that once she is dead, once Mary Jane is dead, he treats their bodies so emotionlessly. There's no care for them at all. They are simply an object that he needs to cut up. It's not like they were real at all. And it is quite horrific when you read about what he did to them after death. And you think, how can somebody treat humans like this? Especially when they're people you've lived with, who've shared your home and your life for so long. And it really says something about him and his mentality and what made him him, because it's shocking reading about it nearly a century later. The aftermath of the murders I find more revealing about who Buck Ruxton really was than the murders themselves. The fact that he could take between 8 and 11 hours to methodically dismember the bodies, to drain them of blood, to take such a long time. So he's cutting them up very methodically, very carefully. He's not rushing the job. And actually this exposes him, it helps convict him, because he is using the professional skills he's learnt to get rid of these bodies. Having dissected the two corpses, Buck Ruxton now set about disposing of the body parts.
He's got a lot of body parts, and he's got a lot of other stuff just associated with bodies. So he tried to there was a lot of stuff that went down the drains. He tried to burn parts in the back garden. He tried to burn bits of carpet. He'd gone out and bought petrol to burn body parts. He was trying to get rid of bits.
He then wrapped them. He wrapped these pieces in the Sunday Graphic newspaper and in a bedsheet, and he even wrapped one portion in the romper suit belonging to one of his children. He then told the charwoman, who would normally come in to clean later that day, not to come in because Isabella and Mary Jane had gone away. After that, he ripped up all the carpets which were soaked with blood. After doing all of that, he put the portions of Mary Jane and Isabella's body body into his car and drove north across the border to the little town of Moffat.
Loaded the body parts into the back of the car and drove from Lancaster up to the town of Moffat and stopped at a place called Garden Home Lynn, which is a little bridge over. Lynn is a Scottish word for waterfall, so there'd be quite a fast-flowing waterfall, quite a lot of water flowing underneath this bridge. So he parked the car and threw all the body parts over the bridge. The Lynn at that time was in spate, so it was a huge amount of water, so he would assume that those body parts would all fly away and go down into the River Annan. In fact, the way that spates work in that part of Scotland is that the water goes as quickly as it comes. So when he threw the body parts over, there was lots of water. Within 48 hours, those body parts would be scattered up the side of the bank.
Obviously, around this time, travelling long distances in cars would be something that would not be routinely undertaken, but he's gone to the lengths of taking these bodies and disposing them some miles away from where he lives. And this really sort of resonates with our understanding about how people try to distance themselves from crime, both physically and psychologically. He wants to go to get rid of the bodies. He hopes they won't be found, but also he hopes that he won't ever have to across them again. So he really goes to quite extreme lengths, if we look back at the time that this happened, to get rid of these bodies.
When he got back to Lancaster, Buck Ruxton tried further to cover his tracks. He visited his friends and acquaintances again, and indeed he even went to the police station saying that his beloved wife had deserted him once again. He was complaining he didn't file a missing persons report, he just wanted to register that Mary Jane and Isabella were no longer living in the house at 2 Dalton Square.
I think initially people believed what he said, and Belle was somebody who, they knew that there were quite often outbursts in the house, and Belle would quite often take off. So that wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was that Mary was absolutely devoted to these children. It seemed very unusual for both of them to go off together.
He went to see Mary Jane Rogerson's family in Morecambe, and he told them that Mary Jane had fallen pregnant by a local youth and that Isabella had taken her away to procure an abortion. Because abortion was then illegal, Ruxton cautioned the Rogersons not to pursue any inquiries into where Mary Jane, their daughter, had gone.
It would be several weeks before the police got involved, following the discovery of body parts which Ruxton thought had been washed out to sea.
There were some people visiting Moffat, staying in Moffat, and they had gone for a walk up the road and looked over the bridge, and the young woman saw what she thought looked like an arm. So we need to get the police. So Sergeant Robert Sloan, who was the local policeman, who was a local community bobby from Moffat, he was dealing with sheep stealing and issues like that. And he turned up at Garden Home Lynn on his bike with his notebook, and it was his actions really over that day that were really important. So what he did, without having any training at all, was secure the crime scene. He noted down exactly what he found where, and I think the following day wrote a really detailed sketch. When people started to arrive and they began to collect the body parts in bags, Sloan hung on the newspaper that was wrapped around the body parts. Now, when he dried the newspapers out and gradually unpicked them, he discovered that they came from the Sunday Graphic and Post, and he was able to identify that these were Lancashire papers, only distributed in the Morecambe, Lancaster area. So that was really significant.
It was pretty quickly clear that they had been carved very carefully into pieces using a surgeon's knife. And it was also very evident very quickly that whoever had done this must have had some form of advanced anatomical knowledge.
Cole had gone out to psychiatric hospitals across the country saying, have you had any doctors who've escaped or who've recently been released who might have done this sort of thing?
People were warned to be on the lookout for a mad doctor, which sums up what Buck Ruxton was. You know, he was mad, he was a doctor, because you think, well, there must have been an element of psychopathy about what he did. But again, it's fascinating that he could maintain this illusion for so long of being this calm, caring doctor, when actually, he was mad underneath. I mean, the madness that he displayed in getting rid of these two women for little reason, no reason. But again, the fact that police were looking for a doctor, that he'd used surgical care, surgical implements to dismember these bodies and get rid of them, it just shows that he was not clever.
The people who ultimately raised a concern in relation to the police were Mary Rogerson's parents, who were concerned because she hadn't been in touch with them, and Ruxton had said that they had gone and that Mary had been pregnant, and they just didn't believe that. So they reported her missing to the police, but surprisingly, actually, the police in Lancaster didn't do anything about that.
But what Mary's parents did do was to put a missing persons notice in the papers for their daughter, and this led to a major breakthrough in the case.
One of the detectives in Glasgow had seen just one of these wee entries in the Glasgow paper, which the Rogersons had put in, saying our daughter Mary is missing, and she's been missing since the middle of September, and she worked for Dr. Buck Ruxton in Lancaster. And that was one of those kind of light bulb moments. So that was Lancaster. They had the papers who were in Lancaster.
And there was one other incident that led not only to Lancaster, but one which placed Ruxton in the Moffat area, where the body parts were found.
Buck was driving north to Moffat, and he knocked down a cyclist. The cyclist wasn't injured, but the cyclist had the presence of mind to note down the registration number and told the police there, and they phoned it through to the next town. So as Buck was going through the next town, he was stopped by the police. He'd driven up to Carlisle to a meeting, and he was coming back, and he had to get back for patients, and so the car wasn't searched. But significantly, what that did do was log him on that road, on that day, in that car.
Ruxton had made one other error, which would point the finger of suspicion at him, and this related to how he'd wrapped up the body parts.
They took the clothing that had been preserved, and they took the blouse to Mary Rogerson's parents, and Mary Rogerson's mother recognised the blouse because she'd done a little repair under one of the armpits, so she positively identified the blouse. And the children's clothes were positively identified as well. Mary had taken the children off to visit somebody, and the lady had given her a bundle of clothes, and the police visited this lady, and she positively identified a pair of children's rompers. So they felt they had enough to bring Buck Ruxton in for an interview.
He told a pack of lies. He repeated the claims that Isabella and Mary Jane had gone away together, and he denied any knowledge of what had happened to them, where they might be, much less that they might have been killed.
So within the character that he's created for himself, he's a doctor, he's got a high esteem in the community, and he's very well respected. And he certainly starts to rely on that and believe that will get him through any advances that the police try to make in terms of investigating the crime. And this is something that he really actually believes is going to get him out of trouble here.
He can't quite believe that he could come under suspicion because he sees himself as this respectable pillar of society, and therefore he should be beyond reproach. And it says something very strongly about his personality, that his main concern when the police were sniffing around was that he didn't want his business to be spoiled by rumours or by gossip. That was his priority, that he wanted to maintain his own image, and he didn't really care about anything else. It's interesting how he tries to dispose of the bodies, because he makes simple mistakes in terms of how he wraps the bundles up, sort of using clothing from the dead women, a newspaper that can easily be identified as only being sold in his local area. So it's clear that although the bodies have been disposed of in Scotland, that they're not from Scotland. So he makes these kind of rookie errors, and yet he's so careful about removing anything that could identify them, but they can still be identified. So he's an interesting combination of thinking he's very, very clever, and yet not being as clever as he thinks. Although the circumstantial evidence was compelling, the police couldn't identify the bodies, and they didn't know how long they'd been there. But this is where cutting-edge forensic science of the day came into play.
This case is an absolutely fascinating case forensically because it uses a lot of pioneering technology and techniques that we kind of take for granted today.
Because the bodies, or the portions of these bodies, had been submerged in water, traditional methods of estimating the time and date of death were always going to be unreliable. And that is where the new science of forensic entomology came in.
Forensic entomology is the study of insects and how their life cycles can be used to determine the time of death.
Bluebottles can sense death from some 10 miles away. So when the body parts are dumped, in comes the bluebottle, lays its eggs in the body part. If you can identify how old these larvae are, you can pin when the body parts were dumped. And that's what Alexander Mearns did. So he was really clear that these body parts were dumped around the 16th or the 17th of September. And that was hugely important. That's the first time that entomology had been used as part of a murder investigation in the UK.
Once they started to recover the body parts, then there is a lot of information that we can start to put together based on our observations about things like bone structure, their skeleton, the pelvis, the skull. And forensic anthropology is a really key area in this case. It's helping them to understand the sex or the biological sex of the individuals concerned. It's helping them to estimate their age and their physical characteristics. And so collectively those kind of features help us to understand that these could be the missing individuals in this case.
Ruxton's dismemberment of the bodies was designed to hide their identities. Aware of the importance of fingerprints, he removed any identifying evidence. However, with their prime suspect in custody, the police could access the Ruxton household.
So the first person that goes in is the fingerprint expert, who's called Hammond, who's been seconded down from Glasgow. Now, what he's got is a really difficult job. He's a fingerprint expert, but remember that Buck Ruxton had removed all of Belle's fingertips, so there were no fingertips for Belle at all. Mary's fingers were really badly decomposed, but he was able to clear away the degraded epidermis and get down to the dermal layer, the layer underneath the epidermis, and take a print of the dermal layer. Now, this had never been done before. They'd never taken a dermal print which they could then match. So he was very keen to get in to the house first before other people started clattering around making a mess of things, and he took lots of prints, and he was able to get prints which there are a corresponding number of points that you have to find on a print which have to correlate with the print on the finger, and he was able to do that. But they wanted to get a second opinion, so it was actually sent to the FBI over in the States to get a second opinion on this. The FBI said that this was indeed a positive ID, and J. Edgar Hoover wrote to the police in Scotland saying how impressed he was that this was a forensic first using a dermal print to do this.
Although the fingerprints had allowed the police to identify Mary, they were still struggling with the other body, which they thought could be Isabella. To help them, they used yet another groundbreaking forensic technique.
She had very strong features, she had a very strong jaw, and they'd managed to collect some photographs from Ruxton's house in Lancaster, and they had a very, very good studio photograph of her that had been done by a professional photographer. And so they had this idea of taking a photograph of the skull that they had and superimposing it on top of the studio photograph to see if there was a match. And that was an absolutely striking. That could not have been anybody else. That was such a striking match. There were other things they did forensically too. They took shoes from the house and were able to take the feet and show that they were a match for the shoes.
Ruxton came to trial in March 1936, and the newspapers and the public were engrossed by the massive evidence against him. However, inside the courtroom, things were not that certain. Faced with the gallows, Ruxton turned on a charm offensive.
He's developed this ability to come across to people as very convincing, very authentic, and he's done this very successfully in the courtroom itself because the jury really believed actually he was not responsible for the murders, and without the forensic evidence, it's likely that they would have remained convinced that he was not involved in this crime.
I think the role of forensic science in this case is quite astonishing, because a lot of the techniques that were applied were techniques that weren't necessarily run of the mill, and the fact that they were able to almost rewind the tape, not only on the murder but also piecing together these individuals, was really powerful. And so I've got no doubt that when this case was at trial and the forensic evidence was presented, it would provide a very compelling picture about what happened to these two victims.
At the trial, there were over 200 exhibits that the prosecution had introduced, and the prosecution provided 106 prosecution witnesses. The trial lasted 11 days. Apparently, it was the longest criminal trial in British history. There was one witness for the defence. Was Buck Ruxton. The jury took an hour to take its verdict. So 11 days of evidence, of this meticulous evidence, and the jury just took 1 hour to find him guilty.
The judge donned the traditional black cap and intoned the only sentence allowed by law. You shall be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
In May 1936, Buck Ruxton was hanged at Strangeways Prison for the murders of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerson. Buck Ruxton wanted to maintain his image to the last minute. The fact that he wanted to go to his death in his best suit with his hair beautifully gelled back, I think sums up the character that he was. It was all about appearances. From, an early age, he wanted to be seen in a particular way. He wanted to be viewed with admiration by people. And even as he was about to be executed, that desire stayed with him.
There was one last twist to this baroque, complicated, convoluted saga. On the Sunday after Ruxton was executed, the News of the World published his own confession. He had given this, a handwritten confession, to the News of the World on one condition. It could only be published after his death.
But those who followed the case closely do not believe the confession to be real.
My own sense about that is that Buck Ruxton he wanted to fit in. He wanted to be an English gentleman. He wanted to be a respected doctor. And that everything that he did was about preserving that part of himself. So to admit it he would have destroyed himself if he admitted he had done that. And I think he believed his own narrative that he had not done that he could not possibly do that to his beloved Belle and to Mary, who he called Little Mary. So he never admitted what he'd done, and I don't think he believed it himself, actually.
Ruxton's case is fascinating because of all the expertise that went into finding him out, that went into identifying his victims to make sure that they had faces and names and didn't go forgotten. And I think it's really been the heralding of a modern era in terms of murder investigations, but also into investigating who victims are and helping to make sure they're remembered. Buck Ruxton thought he was clever, but forensic scientists proved more so. They showed how, faced with a puzzle of body parts, they could still identify the victims, and also their killer.
lăn bánh khiến anh ngẩn ngơ. Nào ai biết có những nỗi mong chờ, vì anh yêu mãi tóc em gợi gà. Này cô bé có mái tóc gợi gà, đạp xe trên phố đông vượt qua. Chờ anh với nếu có lỡ anh về, thì anh xin nói tình cao sánh đôi. Này cô bé có mái tóc gợi gà, đạp xe nhanh quá khiến anh thời. Chờ anh tới sắp tới ngã tư rồi, thì xin em hãy chậm chậm mà thôi. Tóc đôi gà trong gió bay nhẹ ngây ngát lòng anh. Nắng xuân hằng môi thắm em cười chung chim xinh. Ước chỉ là cơn gió hay là tia nắng dạo quanh phố vui. Chớ vội vàng em hãy coi chừng keo không kịp phanh. Giữa con đường thành phố đông người đừng nên chạy nhanh, để anh được nhìn ngắm em cười trong nắng, tóc em vui cả. Này cô bé có mái tóc gợi gà, chiều nay trên phố đón em về qua. Đã áo trắng vẫn trắng mãi trong anh, nụ cười ai đó mà lòng vẫn vương. Này cô bé đã có biết chẳng là bóng xe lăn bánh khiến anh ngẩn ngơ. Nào ai biết có những nỗi mong chờ, vì anh yêu mãi tóc em gợi gà. Nào ai có biết có những nỗi mong chờ, vì anh yêu mãi tóc em gợi gà.
The following program contains descriptions of real-life violence that some viewers may find distressing.
Unless it's happened to you or someone you know, you really, really struggle to take all this in. You're thinking, did that really just happen? Did someone just try and kill me? I've gone from married, dreams coming, everything, in a split second, I'm fighting for my life. This is where you go to a shock. You try and think about someone's mentality to do this to another human being. I think it's monstrous.
He said, there's blood all over the floor, blood all over the bathroom. The logical person would dial 999. The fact that Richard then took another day to phone the police, it beggars belief. When I met Richard Thompson with his huge facial injuries, it was quite clear this case was a runner. But Richard, he had wasted 3 days and allowed the scene to be destroyed. And even when he contacted the police, purely said, I want this logged in case I divorce her. Unbelievable. He was coerced into a hugely controlling relationship, and he didn't see the wood for the trees.
As she walked out the door, she turned back and said, you'll never be able to tell anyone what I did to you. Almost like a warning.
Do you think that she meant that you would be too embarrassed to tell anyone?
There could be that element there. The only thing I find embarrassing, that I was suckered into this. Being suckered into laying on a floor is pretty horrendous. It's trust. That's the only way I got myself into that situation.
We've got this whole issue of the male ego. Richard was embarrassed to admit what he'd been through. But 20 or 30 years ago, the male psyche was one of dominance. We were a very misogynistic society. And so the possibility that a man will be targeted by a woman was alien to most people. And Richard could not accept that the person he'd married would go to such lengths to kill him. He said to me, you can't switch on and off. And that's the point. The scary thing about Dina, it starts with a love story.
I was like a modern-day globetrotter. Financially wise, I was comfortable. But what I didn't realise is that longer and longer I was working abroad, my social network was just getting smaller and smaller.
What did you do?
Well, in those days, back in the late 90s, there was nothing else but Lonely Heart columns. You had a code in your advert. Then you could dial in and see if anyone left a message.
Were you optimistic?
I'm always optimistic. I thought, oh yeah, she sounds nice, we'll meet up. She was very bubbly, extrovert, I'm an extrovert, confident, and these are things that I found attractive. Dina said, oh, I'm off to Florida in a couple of months. I go fishing in Florida. Would you like to join me? My hobby all my life has been fishing. I jumped at the chance. The stuff I was catching in the English Channel, they class as bait out there. And that's when Dina put her first hook in me. We stayed in this little place called St. Pete Beach. She knew the layout of the place. She knew restaurants. Even the Americans called it paradise.
We went out, we did a little grouper fishing, a little snapper fishing. She was affectionate towards him, and he was affectionate towards her. It was that banter back and forth. She was definitely like the alpha in charge on that deal. Like, I remember her making like loaded comments to me.
She was dancing with you?
Oh, of course, yeah. This was all a big act. She was like very good at what she did. He was under a spell, basically.
There was attraction there, a very, very strong friendship, and that's why we decided to get married. That night, she said, I've got something to tell you. She told me a couple of years ago she'd won the lottery. It wasn't the jackpot, but it was £300,000.
Why did she tell you about it on your wedding night?
Who knows? Who knows? Was she hatching a plan? Was she putting these seeds in my head?
When I sit down and think about it, it's really clear that Dina had an agenda from the very beginning. Out to scam him, steal his money. It's unbelievable, really. Unbelievable.
Did you have any inkling of all this when you met her?
Who could have? That she was a thief, a fraudster, and a murderer. I did find a few things strange. After Dina moved in, then the fishing and crewing for me stopped. He told me that he had put her on the land registry documents, so she was a joint owner of the cottage. I was surprised at that.
Probably about 6 months after we got married, I rung home and she said, I have cancer. Well, of course you're worried. And I was worried. Cancer's that horrible word. I took her to hospital and I collected her. She said, let's move out to Florida and let me live my last few years living a really good dream, and I'll set you up in business with the lottery money.
Dina said, Richard's leaving for the States and he won't be coming back.
Why did Dina tell you? Why didn't Richard just tell you?
Don't know. That was a bit strange. I think probably because she was in control by that time. I think I probably felt, oh, well, that's the end of a friendship.
Although Richard didn't want to press charges, his injuries were so severe we were able to get a warrant for Dina's arrest. She was in Devon, living at her parents'. I rang the local police station and said, "We need her arrested as quickly as you can." Then she was brought back to Sussex to be interviewed.
I first met Dina when she had been arrested for the attempted murder of Richard Thompson. I gave her a look to say, "I know what you've done and I'm going to put you away." And then something really strange happened. I remember it vividly. She gave me the look. I got the Dina look. She has this really alluring look that entices men in. It didn't work with me, but it wasn't lost on me that she did it to me in the most bizarre of circumstances while she was under arrest for attempted murder. I think that demonstrates to me just how dangerous she is.
At that point, the pressure was on to get the evidence together to keep her in custody. But we're way behind. We'd lost 2 to 3 days because Richard had waited so long to report the incident.
Because he still loved her. And as he said to me, "I've been loving this woman for nearly a year. She's my wife. She may have done wrong, but I believe in my wedding vows." I said to him, "If you don't help us, Richard, I'm going to carry on with this anyway." Luckily, Richard did come to his senses, and we went for the prosecution.
You're piecing it all together in your mind. I'm concussed, basically. Eventually, the reality does set in, and you realise how horrific this was, and how worse it could have been. Suppose she stabbed me through the throat. Suppose she'd hit me in the jugular, because it's only a few inches away. The detectives were great. They came, they said, "We believe you." And there was a lot to explain. The day after the attack, at 8:30, knock at the door. There's a guy in a suit with a clipboard. He said, "Oh, your wife's selling the house. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Florida."
Richard had signed over his last will and testament to Dina. He'd signed over a power of attorney to her. Richard said he was going to sell his house and take everything. He went to his bank accounts. All the money was gone.
The £30,000 of my pension payment, £12,000 on the American Express, the £5,000 check. She knew exactly what she was going to do, and she explained how I wasn't going to be there. There's your premeditation. Had she achieved killing me, how she was going to dispose of me, who knows?
Dina's remanded in custody, but we have a ticking clock. The trial is coming. And sure enough, she went for the self-defence argument. She said that Richard had tried to kill her. But Dina was examined for injuries and had no injuries. The problem in a case like this, particularly with partners, is it is one word against another. We needed more than that.
As the forensics team went over the crime scene, they discovered that the attempt to clean up wasn't perfect. Fortunately, when you look at it more closely, behind the radiator, quite high up on the walls, Richard's blood spattings were found all around the room. It was a relief that not all of the evidence had been lost. And then we have another major breakthrough. Dina had an address book. It was full of names of men with their addresses, telephone numbers and business cards. And we were tasked to go through it and call all these numbers. And one of the numbers, this chap answers, and he is horrified. He says, "I'm married, I will lose my wife, I'll probably lose my job, please don't call me again." Some of the people flatly denied that anything ever happened, and I don't believe them. We did establish more than 10 more victims. These guys, they meet her, she's too good to be true, telling people that she'd won lotteries, and how rich she was, and how ill she was, none of which was true. And they had been subjected to her maxing up in their credit cards and then dumping them.
30 years ago, it was a very unusual modus operandi for a woman to target men. There's this male desire to keep things private, which is why Dina got away with so much. We established patterns of behaviour with these men. There may have been different lies, there may have been different backgrounds to the men and to the stories, but there was always the American dream. The American dream was all about moving to a beautiful place and live happily ever after.
Dina was promising Lee that he would be going to America with her, and Julian was going to do fishing trips and work for the Tampa Tribune. Richard thought he was going off to do this job in Florida. His green card had come. And this is a theme that runs through all her other victims as well. But why she was so obsessed with Florida, the Daco ever really established.
What was also very clear was that there was a lot of sex, and the sex was very adventurous. It became apparent it was part of the coercive game.
She would phone me randomly to say she's into, she's into bondage and whips, and I'm laughing because maybe it's just like knowing that I'm a bit blinking strange and prudish. I can't say that if you walked into a room and you saw her that you'd go, well, she's very attractive. I still feel very much that her attraction would be her attitude maybe to sex.
One thing we never saw with Dina is any form of sympathy or empathy. We never found a natural, healthy relationship with a man or a woman in her life. And that, I think, speaks volumes about the psychology of her mind. The mother wouldn't speak to us at all, and the father was very anti-police, which I found staggering because the father was a prison officer. And this suggested a warped mentality, which I think rubbed off on her.
She never really talked about her childhood, but she spoke about gymnastics and going abroad with her father. She never mentioned her mother at all. It was always Dad this or Dad did that. Just seemed like if anything was going wrong, he would be the person that would sort it out. But like when she talked about the gymnastics and things like that, something just doesn't seem right.
As more and more evidence came to light, you figure it out. When the police did a very thorough search of the cottage, they found a tin that was full of photographs of this other guy, Julian Webb. No idea, never heard of this person. The police explained that Julian had met his end in what they regarded as suspicious circumstances. Who I now know was her second husband, Julian Webb. But I didn't have any knowledge of Julian Webb until this moment.
In some respects, your memories of people still live. I think it's counterproductive to get sort of mawkish and morbid. It really is. It doesn't help anybody.
Had you got to the point where you thought perhaps you weren't going to get justice for Julian?
I don't know if I thought so negatively as that, but it's what kept me going. I think it was Martin Underhill called me and told me she was about to appear in court for the attempted murder of Richard Thompson. I could have fallen off my chair. Having seemingly got away with murder once, here she was having another go.
All rise. This court is now in session. Dina Thompson, you are charged that you unlawfully took out a credit card in Richard Thompson's name, therefore therefore committing fraud. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
You are charged that you did unlawfully attack Mr. Thompson with a baseball bat and that you stabbed him with a knife, therefore committing attempted murder. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Dina looked very, very small in the witness box. And she admitted that she had lied to Richard about her health, and it was solely so that she would get some sympathy from him.
I was very apprehensive about the court case. When Dina was on the stand, she said that I was in the bathroom trimming curtains with a carving knife, and then said that when she confessed that all my money had gone, that's when I attacked her.
She said that he'd come at her with a knife. He'd managed to grab the baseball bat, hit him twice with it to defend herself, and then got the knife off of him and stabbed him because she thought her life was in danger. She was asked, "Did you love Richard Thompson?" She just said no. Richard was broken by that. This was a dagger through his heart, really.
Hearing someone say that, we realised I was the means to an end. I think I was in the dock for at least 2 days. They were trying to convince the jury I was the aggressor. I was totally frustrated with the ridiculous questions I was asked.
In court, he would sit there, and if he didn't like what he was hearing, he would slap his hands down. Said to him, "The jury are watching your every move, Richard."
Her mother and father gave evidence on her behalf. I don't think either of them think that Dina could do anything wrong, which seems astonishing to me, really.
Of course, Julian couldn't be mentioned to the jury, but I was confident in the evidence. We had all of the motives that we knew about, the coerciveness towards Richard. It was a slam dunk for me.
They came back in and asked to hear the original call from Richard Thompson to the police.
Richard Thompson phoned up to say my wife tried to kill me. I just want it logged in case I seek a divorce. So that's what seemed to create a question of doubt for the jury.
The Black Widow, as she's become known, stood trial for the attempted murder of Richard Thompson.
Mrs. Thompson had denied that she tried to kill her husband.
After stabbing and beating him with a baseball bat, she was acquitted of attempted murder.
The jury accepted that she had acted in self-defense.
When I heard the verdict, I was absolutely devastated. I have been through hell. And I thought, how on earth did the jury not see what was happening?
I thought we had got Dina and that she was going to prison for a substantial amount of time. But I was wrong.
We had to shrug it off and carry on fighting. And that's why on the same day as the acquittal, I announced we were reopening the Julian Webb case.
The events portrayed in this trial and the unusual nature of Julian Webb's death means that Sussex Police will re-examine the circumstances of that death.
I was determined to stop Dina and get justice for Rosemary Webb. We now knew that Dina was obsessed with insulin. We'd heard from 5 other men that they'd been injected with insulin. If you inject someone with insulin, you will cause shaking, you'll be disoriented, your temperature will rise, and if it's enough insulin, you will die. And the theory I came up with is that Dina had used insulin on Julian to incapacitate him, and over several days she made him ingest aspirin and thiopin. And suddenly I had a line from A to B of how a young man went from being fit and healthy to a dead body a week later. But we had a problem. If you have a suspicious death, you have a forensic post-mortem. And Sean said to me we didn't do that. it was classified as an unexpected death, not a suspicious death, even though many people had their own doubts. If you are trying to find long-term drugs in someone's body, it would be in their hair. I realised that I would have to exhume the body. There are only 4 or 5 forensic exhumations in this country a year. I reached out to the world's expert on exhumation at that time. His first question to me completely threw me. And he said, "Martin, is there a tree next to the body?" Because the tree roots suck all the water out and save the body decomposing. So, of course, straight away, we drove to Hailing Island. We found Julian's plot, and it was right next to an oak tree.
I'm very much a person who believes you go back to the earth, that you never really go away. Your chemicals, your spirit is there in the natural world. It's not nothing, it's something else. It's things like that that makes me wish I was religious, because I would then imagine we would meet again in some form, and that's hard to deal with.
It was a really daunting experience. Each 6 inches you go down, you have to take soil samples because the bodies do leak fluid and they do leak poison. After about 2 hours, we got to the coffin. That was heavy duty. We were lucky. 96, 97% of his body was intact. Very little of it had decomposed. But if we didn't get anything back from the post-mortem, in the case would be closed. The forensic post-mortem showed that small amounts of the thiopin had been fed to Julian over several days. It was enough to question whether Dina had killed Julian Webb. I remember punching the air. I was absolutely over the moon. But the thiopin tastes very bitter. How did Dina get Julian to take the thiopin without knowing? To prove she did it, I needed the answer to that question. But the results of the scientists came in the late summer of 2000. On the 1st of July 2000, Sussex Police started investigating the biggest murder inquiry it had ever launched, which was the Sarah Payne case. We had to catch and lock up the person who'd abducted and killed this little girl. And so we're going to have to park this. But it was really frustrating. I just started getting into the swing with this case, but I knew I would go back to it. Rosemary kept everything in relation to her son's death. Everything.
Let's have a look.
And that's when I first heard about Don Hudson.
Dear Don, how's things? Are you enjoying your beer? And here's another one. Dear Don and Kathy, happy Christmas to you both and hope to see you soon, Julian and Dina.
Some of the letters were sent after Julian's death, where Don had written condolences to Dina. And so I was determined to find Don because I wanted to know his version of what he thought happened to Julian and how Julian died. And the first thing I did was contact the local police in Tampa and ask for their help.
I got a message that I needed to speak to some British detectives, English bobbies. They got an accent, you know. Hello, JD. Could you be of some service, possibly? Yes, sir. Yeah, I can help you out, brother. What you got? We need to find Don Hudson. We would run, just the standard driver's license checks to see if there's anything available on that person. But there was just nothing that we could, locate them at. And I believe that ultimately led to Martin and Sean coming here.
As soon as we landed, I think we were probably curiosities. Yeah, we were. They loved the accent.
And they wanted us to know if we brought our hats with us and all that sort of thing, of course.
Did you?
No. There were lots of reasons why we went to America. One was to trace Don Hudson, but also it strengthened the plank of the American dream. We only had 4 days, so we immersed ourselves in the fishing community of southeast Florida. We went everywhere. Marinas, yacht yards, pubs, restaurants. We spent 3 days looking for him and our time was running out. We were flying home in 2 days. I really wanted to find Don Hudson because I knew he was a personal friend of Julian's, and we had a really strong clue that he had spoken to Dina after the death. So I decided to use the media. Hi, this appeal is for Don Hudson, who's an American living in Florida. I am Detective Inspector Underhill, and this is
Detective Constable Sean MacDonald.
And we're both from the Sussex Police in England. I didn't want the American press exaggerating or running off with the wrong idea, and of course they did. Within 24 hours, we were Scotland Yard detectives, and Don was a suspect in a murder.
Within a day, Don Hudson contacted me. The dude was pissed that his name was associated with a police investigation.
He was incredibly angry. Yeah, how dare you come over to this country and tell everyone that I'm a murder suspect, you've ruined my life. I got him to agree for me to go and see him at this huge outdoor hunting lodge. There was lots of taxidermy animals there. 6-foot-tall bear. There was an alligator. The whole thing was gun-centric, man-centric. When I met him there, he was incredibly hostile. He gave me both barrels. I said, look, this has just completely been exaggerated beyond all belief. Slowly we brought him down, and then he started talking. He told us the story that Don and Julian had met through fishing. They corresponded together, they spoke on the phone. He said the last time he spoke to Dina was a couple of days after Julian died. Dina called Don and said, sorry, Julian's dead. She said he had a really hot curry. Next morning, I found him dead in bed. It looks like he had killed himself. And I went, whoa, 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 whoa. What was that you just said? That was the moment for me. That was my Pandora's box. Can you conceal the taste of tethionine in a curry? Yes, of course you can. Suddenly, to me, everything clicked into place. That was how she gave me the tablets. It was that eureka moment for me. I was a man possessed from then on. I thought, I've got you now.
Dina Holmes arrived at Crawley Police Station in West Sussex just before 10 o'clock this morning. Shortly afterwards, detectives began questioning her about the death of her former husband 8 years ago.
Dina was arrested, but wouldn't speak to us. She chose to provide a prepared statement.
There was only 2 people in the house on that night, you and Julian. Of course, sadly, Julian can't help, but you were there, Dina. Tell me what happened.
I've given you
and I'm not giving you any more.
Case, it was undeniable that she was a liar. That in itself doesn't get you very far in proving a case of murder. We had put together a lot of strands of evidence about Dina's extraordinary, I would say, deformed personality, about her dishonesty, her motives, and about her very curious conduct in the period up to Julian's death and immediately after. Days before Julian died, Lee unexpectedly turned up at Dina's house. Had Julian and Lee met, then the bigamy would have come out. I mean, if Lee had started to tell Julian what had happened to him, well, imagine what the effect would have been on Julian and on Dina's marriage to him. And so maybe she decided relatively quickly to kill him. And that time frame, Lee turns up, it's only a week later that Julian dies. Is it just a coincidence?
She didn't want to get caught. Suddenly, I had not just the method in which she'd given Julian Webb a fatal dose of tethiopic, I also had a motive, and I thought that the pieces are coming together. One of my analysts had created an A3 chart, and I called it a story on a page. And we had each victim's name and the story that they were told. I said, when the jury go into the jury room, having listened to a very bizarre story, I want them to refer to a piece of paper, and it's all there. A repetitive serial fraudster who used violence when it was necessary.
It was back to the thrill of the chase again.
You excited?
Well, I suppose anticipation, but I think mostly thankfulness that something had been recognised at last. I think that was the overwhelming feeling. Couldn't contemplate that the perpetrator would get away with it.
Dina Thompson was described in court as a very disturbed person.
Police say she was motivated by money and hatred of men.
Thompson denies murder and the trial continues.
Here I was presenting the jury and, in effect, the public with this very intimate analysis of what we thought was going on in this woman's mind and her very remarkable and distorted personality. But I never heard her speak.
Dina didn't testify in court, and I think there's one reason for that. Because the lawyer has said, if you go near that stand, your story will collapse.
A woman's been jailed for life for murdering her second husband by poisoning his curry on his 31st birthday.
Curry. Poison and curry.
Sentencing Dina Thompson to life imprisonment, the judge, Michael Hyam, told her nothing could excuse you for the wickedness of what you did.
Dina Thompson is tonight beginning a life sentence for murder.
She is dishonest, untruthful, manipulative, deceitful, and scheming.
We got there. It was one of these sort of highs, adrenaline flow. You could have gone out and danced all night, sort of thing. It's still really hard to believe that I know that person. If someone goes, what does a murderer look like? Well, not Dina.
I remember there would be moments where if you thought something, she'll be reminiscing the same thing. And that's where I thought we were going, as one. It makes me sick now, actually, when I think about it. Because to me, that was a wasted life with her. She's paid for her crimes, but she hasn't paid for her crime against me.
She still goes by the name Dina Thompson. She still uses your surname.
Yeah, I find that odd.
Do you think she ever loved you?
No. I have accepted it. A hard acceptance. But I had no choice. I had to accept this and move on.
It would be much easier to entrap then now than it was in her day. Now you just swipe left or right on an app. You can spot vulnerabilities in people just on their profiles online.
What better age for somebody like Dina to then start targeting my age group? So has the story finished after 30 years? We'll wait and see what the next chapter says.
Would she do it again?
Yes, I'm sure she would. I don't think she can help herself. I hope I'm wrong.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, help is available online at sky.com/viewer support.